In this video, we're heading to Massachusetts, where we're going to check out some revolutionary battlefields, revolutionary industry, and learning all things about whaling. I hope you enjoyed the video. First stop is in Lowell, Massachusetts. We're here visiting the Lowell National Historical Park. We are seeing some of the Lowell mills that were created and some that still operate just for show. Lowell, Massachusetts was founded during the Industrial Revolution by Francis Cabot Lowell. He was an industrial spy. He went to England during their Industrial Revolution and spied on some of the textile mills over there and learned the tricks of the trade to bring back to the United States. He turned what were sort of smaller mills in places like Rhode Island and Pawtucket into much larger industrial towns like we see in Lowell, Massachusetts. And here we see the history of Lowell as it grew and helped the United States enter its own industrial revolution. Right now we're heading into boot cotton mills, and I wanted to show you this right here, which is a canal. So these canals are all over the city of Lowell. They were built to bring the power of the Merrimack River to these mills. All of these mills, the turbines within them, were powered by the canals that were built off the Merrimack River. Being in this room, you can really get the sense of what industrialization is all about. There's just loom after loom here that would have been turning all day, every day, turning cotton into textiles. And just in this room alone, you can imagine how much productivity there must have been. So you can get the sense that just this single floor of this mill is producing so many textiles, but there were mills all across New England. You can really understand how the Industrial Revolution industrialized the economy, industrialized the markets. There was just so much that was now available to the public. Before the Industrial Revolution, what started happening was the putting out system. So these manufacturers, let's say a manufacturer of shoes, would have hired local families to produce one small part of the shoe. Maybe one family cuts out the soles, another family cuts out a specific leather piece, and they would send it in. And this started to industrialize the process, right? So one shoemaker was now able to make so many more shoes because they were hiring these local families. It also helped get money to these smaller farmers who were maybe having a hard time feeding their family or making enough money. You might be wondering who worked the Lowell mills. Pretty interesting. The Lowell mills first employees were, for the most part, women. Oftentimes it was girls from New England families, New England farms, who really weren't playing a role for the family on those farms. So in Lowell, they recruited young women from around New England who might not have roles on their farms or whose families could use some extra money. So those women were sent down to Lowell to live in the boarding houses here at the Lowell mills, and they worked these machines. Kind of a double-edged sword a little bit. It gave a lot of women their first opportunity for a job to earn money, gave them a little bit of independence, but oftentimes they were working in really dangerous conditions. Their pay was obviously not great, and the boarding houses had really, really strict rules on who they could talk to, who they could interact with. There was no drinking. They had to go to church on Sunday. So an interesting opportunity for women in America to kind of gain their first independence, but surely with flaws as well. One thing that's pretty eerie is the amount of water buckets they have for fires. If you've heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, this was a fire in New York City in a shirt factory there, and there was a fire that started, and there were just no safety precautions at all in most of these factories, and the results were devastating. So many lost their lives, so many ended up jumping out of the factory to try to escape the fire. one positive thing that came out of it was a lot more government regulation on kind of safety practices, think kind of OSHA standards that ended up going into factories to try to avoid things like that. And one of those regulations would be buckets like this and ensuring that they were actually filled with water.
2 times, maybe a little bit more per second.
There's only about 15 machines going right now, and it is so loud. You can imagine how loud it would get when all of these machines are going at the same time. One thing that can't be overlooked when considering the success of the Lowell mills was the enslavement of millions of Africans in the South. During this time period, cotton production, cotton plantations in the South is really what powered the Lowell mills. So with the success of the mills, the textile mills in Lowell, it also came with the longevity of slavery in the South and the demand for more and more cotton coming from the South. Textile production was no flash in the pan. Kind of started with the Lowell mill girls, but as they kind of started fighting for workers' rights, better pay, they weren't really getting it because what happened was the Irish immigrants came over in the 1840s, fleeing the Irish potato famine. So these were immigrant workers who were willing to work for these low wages. And then this trend actually continued. So new waves of immigrants who came to the United States were willing to work for low wages. There wasn't much unionization that happened. So a lot of times the wages stayed really low in the Lowell mills, and these factories operated for a very long time. Through the early 1900s. Eventually, however, it was the South where the textile manufacturing in the country ended up going. So there were less labor laws, cheaper labor, more land in the South. So a lot of the factories that were in the Northeast actually moved down to the South. And that's really what brought an end to the textile mills and the mill system in the Northeast. However, many of these buildings were transformed and they changed. So different type of manufacturing took hold in these places, and even outside of manufacturing, many of these mill buildings were turned into apartment buildings. I actually lived in one of these mill buildings when I lived in Manchester, New Hampshire. So this is a replica of a company-owned boarding home. This is where many of the Lowell girls lived when employed by the mill system. That wraps up our trip to the Lowell mills. Biggest thing that always stands out to me is just the magnitude of what the Industrial Revolution really was. So just getting to see the amount of power, the amount that was produced on that one floor we saw of those moving machines. You got to think about how grand of a scale that was, with how many mills there were, how many floors there were, all producing textiles at the same time, just for decades and decades. All right, we're here at Minuteman National Historic Park. Minuteman National Park is to honor and to remember the history of the first battles of the American Revolution. So here at Lexington and Concord, the first shots of the Revolution were fired and the war began. Before independence was declared, what was going on in the colonies were really high taxes. The taxes were a result of the British Empire trying to make up for their many, many wars going on throughout the 1700s, most notably the French and Indian War. The British felt that since the French and Indian War was a defense of their colonies in what would become the United States, they thought the colonists should pay for them, so they increased the taxes. A lot of people think, well, that's the only reason the war started, was because the colonists were paying the taxes. But you might be familiar with the saying, no taxation without representation. There's a high likelihood that the colonists would have been fine paying taxes if they had proper representation within the British government. So without this representation, a lot of colonists started to rebel against these taxes and rebel against the British government. The colony that was most rebellious was Massachusetts. By 1775, Massachusetts was really up in arms. They had their port closed down. You might be familiar with the Boston Tea Party, which was an act of rebellion against the British East India Trading Company in the Boston Harbor. And due to this, the British sent more and more soldiers into Massachusetts to try to quell the rebellion. In April 18th, they decided to deploy about 700 soldiers to Lexington and Concord, where the goal was for the British to seize a cache of firearms that was being held by the Minutemen, by the Massachusetts militia. When this news was heard of, Paul Revere had his famous midnight ride warning those in Lexington and Concord that the British regulars were coming to kind of seize that cache of weapons. As of hearing this, the militia got together and decided to fight back against the British regulars who had come to Lexington and Concord to try to seize those weapons. So on April 19th, the famous shot heard around the world was fired. No one knows who took the first shot, but the colonists of Massachusetts were now officially in open rebellion against the British. And so the American Revolution, the first battle, started here at Lexington and Concord. Only a few people lost their lives in the fighting, and the battles really only lasted a few minutes. But that is what was enough to really signify or signal to the British that the colonists were in open rebellion. Minuteman National Historic Park covers a huge area. What the park essentially is the exact road that the British marched in on from Lexington to Concord. So it's a really long path, and there are some houses along that path that you can see, old colonial homes. We're here at the North Bridge. This is the extent that the British were able to march into Concord. The battle started in Lexington, and that's where the first shots were fired, but then the British continued up into Concord. But this bridge here, the North Bridge, is where they were able to march to, and where eventually they decided to retreat back to Charlestown. So the battle saw the loss of a few colonists' lives, but overall it was sort of a victory, but hard to say exactly that it was a resounding victory. Many of you are probably familiar with what a Minuteman is, but if you're not, a Minuteman was someone who was a colonist who needed to be ready at a minute's notice to be ready for combat. So the idea of the Minutemen is very obvious at Lexington and Concord. Paul Revere rode through, warned the militias in Lexington and Concord that the British were coming, and much of the militia were ready to go, ready to fight that next day. Many of them were farmers, were artisans, but they were colonists who were willing to take up the fight against the British. If you're coming to Minuteman National Historic Park, just be prepared to walk. It's not quite as built up with infrastructure as Lowell Mills were. So if you're coming here, a lot of the sites are pretty good walking distance between, right? So that the soldiers marched from Lexington all the way to Concord. They're two separate towns, so this path, these trails are really, really long. That being said, it's a great place to get out, go for a walk, bring your dog. It seems like everybody has their dog here, so it's a really neat place to get outside, explore a little history, and be able to adventure a little bit. All right, we are here at the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site.
Who was Frederick Law Olmsted?
Frederick Law Olmsted was the first ever professional landscape architect. That's basically just a fancy term for he was the first one to really design and build beautiful parks in the United States. His most famous work being Central Park in New York City. However, we're here in Boston. After completing Central Park, he moved up to Boston in the Brookline area, where he contributed by building the Emerald Necklace. The Emerald Necklace is about a 7-mile long trail with different connecting parks. They're very beautiful, like Jamaica Pond, Boston Common is in there, and the Arnold Arboretum, which is Harvard's Arboretum. We're cutting through the public garden to get to our next destination. So I'm here at the Museum of African American History in Boston. It is on Beacon Hill, and the focus of this museum is about Massachusetts' role in African American history, with a real focus on the abolitionist movement. So this museum has the Smith School, which was essentially the first public school for African American children in the entire country. I believe it founded in the 1830s. The school did a so-so job at educating the black community, and there were a lot of flaws with it. But it's interesting to see that this was the first fight for integrated schools and providing public schools for African Americans. It is also the location of the African American Meeting House. This is where a lot of African Americans were first able to flex their First Amendment right, their right to freedom of speech, and kind of challenge the norms of the times and push for abolition. So individuals like Frederick Douglass, David Walker would be tied to this area. So we were just at Faneuil Hall. Faneuil Hall was built in the mid-1700s. It was used for a variety of things. It was kind of a town meeting house. It was used as a market, but it was really the center of politics for Boston in the mid 1700s. One thing I saw that was pretty interesting is that before even the revolution started, it was kind of this house of democracy, but only 5% of Boston was actually represented there. It was only the land-owning white men were truly represented by the city's government. All right, we're going to be taking a ferry across Boston Harbor over to Charlestown to see a few more sites in the Boston National Historic Park. So this boat here will take you to Boston Harbor Islands National Park and State Park. So there are all these islands scattered throughout Boston Harbor that you can go visit on this ferry. And this ferry is named Codzilla, which is pretty cool. This ferry takes off right next to the aquarium, so you can see some seals playing over here. Alright, we are at the USS Constitution. The USS Constitution is also known as Old Ironsides. It got that nickname during the War of 1812, or America's Second War for Independence. This war was centered around some naval conflicts that were going on between Great Britain and the United States in 1812. The British Navy kept confiscating American merchant ships and forcing those merchants to serve in the British Navy, which is pretty messed up. So the US kind of had to stand up for itself. They needed to prove their legitimacy as a nation and stand up to the British a second time, and then that war began. So it got its nickname, Old Ironsides, during one battle where it was said cannonballs were bouncing off of the ship as if it had iron sides. A few other interesting facts: it is the oldest warship in the world that is still afloat, and much of the ship has been restored. Just the hull, the very bottom part, is actually still some of the original wood, but just about everything else has been replaced over time. Since the park is so spread out, the city created what is known as the Freedom Trail. It is this convenient brick path that is crisscrossing throughout the city to help you find your way to national historic monuments. The Freedom Trail is now taking us to Bunker Hill Monument. The Battle of Bunker Hill took place just a few months after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. British troops had Boston under complete control in early 1775. So the colonists' first mission was to try to get the British soldiers out of Boston. To do so, they set up a fort on the outside of the city in Charlestown. Well, they built that fort and the British troops didn't like it very much, so they sent about 2,000 soldiers out to Bunker Hill, where the fort was, to try to remove the colonists. There, in June, a battle took place, and the British were able to remove the colonists. However, over 1,000 of the British soldiers died. So even though it was an American loss, it was really the first opportunity for the American colonists to prove they could stand up to the British. Before us, stretching skyward, is the obelisk that was constructed to memorialize those who lost their lives fighting at Bunker Hill. .294 steps, let's do it. behind me is Old North Church, and its role in the Revolution was letting Paul Revere know how the British troops were coming. So the old saying, "Oneth by land, twoeth by sea." What they were referring to was lanterns in the steeple of Old North Church. So if the British troops were coming by land, they were going to hang one lantern. If they were coming by sea, they were hanging two lanterns. Two lanterns went up, and this gave Paul Revere the chance to take his midnight ride to alert those in Lexington and Concord. All right, we're heading to the National Whaling Museum in New Bedford. We're going to learn a little bit about the whaling industry in the U.S. Whaling may seem like a cruel industry, and that's because it was. So what they would do would be to go out in these ships and hunt whales, kill them, and then bring their carcasses back on board, where they would boil the whale flesh and extract all the oil from them and put them into casks. So pretty gruesome, but you can learn a lot about the process here, and more about what life was like for the sailors. Nothing, this is just B-roll. So the oil from the whales went to a few things. Some of it went to lubricating the machines that were being used in the Industrial Revolution. Some of it was being used to light the homes as a fuel source across the nation and across the world. The whaling industry was huge. What started off in the Atlantic eventually went down the coast of South America and then back up the coast of South America into the Pacific Ocean. There were just hundreds and hundreds of whale ships, and thousands of whales were killed in the industry. All right, we're going to be heading just down the road to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. So a separate museum that's just a bit bigger. Whaling was a really interesting experience for people because oftentimes people on their first trips would end up losing money. So if you joined a whaling vessel for your first year, you didn't really know how things worked. Oftentimes young men would join these whaling expeditions and would end up owing the ship money because they would have these stores of new clothing that they might buy without realizing that the shirts that they would accumulate are coming out of the company till. So by the time they get back to shore and they get all of these new shirts, they ended up losing money on the trip. So Nantucket and New Bedford were founded by Quakers. Who were the Quakers? The Quakers were a religious group who were pacifists, who were mostly abolitionists, and this kind of led New Bedford and Nantucket to be some of the most diverse places in New England in the 1800s. Many freed African Americans coming from slavery found success in the whaling industry, so it led to it being an incredibly diverse place. There were also a lot of opportunities for Native Americans in the area to work on whaling vessels. Much of what people in Nantucket, New Bedford learned about whaling came from the Native Americans of the area. There were even some superstitions that it was bad luck to ever go out on a whaling journey without Native Americans on board. Many times the whaling expeditions didn't have a timetable. The whalers would be done when their barrels were all filled on their ship. Could be months, could be years potentially. The whaling industry led to a pretty unusual social dynamic for the people of New Bedford and Nantucket. Because these journeys were so long, it gave an opportunity for women to take up a lot of their responsibility in the household and in the towns of New Bedford and Nantucket. So it provided an interesting opportunity for women to be leading figures in these towns, which oftentimes wasn't the case in most New England towns of the time. Recently I read the book In the Heart of the Sea, which is about the doomed whale ship Essex, which went out of Nantucket. And in that book, it really described how Nantucket was the premier whaling city. And it's interesting being in New Bedford and seeing, you know, all the signage and all the postage about how really was New Bedford. So it was kind of interesting to see that rivalry played out in different ways. If you read that book In the Heart of the Sea, it definitely talks about how Nantucket was really the cream of the crop and New Bedford was a bit below it. So interesting to see a different perspective in this museum. You can see some of these buildings still have the Widow's Walk for wives to watch as their husbands return from the whaling ships. One thing this museum does a really great job of is showing kind of the global connection that New Bedford had. Sailors traveled to Polynesia, Japan in search of whales, and in that search they stumbled across really unique and interesting cultures, and this museum does a great job of kind of emphasizing that and what came out of those connections. The whale. He wanted to see like this stuff. The whale tooth carvings. So that museum did a really nice job. They had way more artifacts than I was expecting. So that, like, room of scrimshaw, for example, they just had a ton of different, you know, primary sources if you're looking to learn, or just artifacts if you wanted to see what it was like at the time. I would kind of suggest, if you are in the area, going to the Lowell Mills Museum and this museum. It's really interesting to see kind of two very different industries going on at the exact same time. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe to the Constant Travel YouTube channel. Hope to see you next time.